Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Warminster Thing, an enigma that once held a small English town in a grip of pure, sonic terror. Imagine, if you will, the county of Wiltshire in the mid-1960s. It is a place of ancient mysteries, where the rolling green hills of the Salisbury Plain hide secrets older than memory. The air here often feels heavy, perhaps burdened by the proximity of Stonehenge or the sprawling military ranges, where the earth occasionally trembles under the weight of distant artillery. But the events that began on the morning of December 25th, 1964, were not born of gunpowder or ancient stone. They were born of the air itself. The town of Warminster was a quiet market community of roughly 10,000 souls, a place where the rhythm of life followed the chime of church bells and the predictable cycles of the seasons. On that particular Christmas morning, the world was wrapped in a biting, festive cold. The sky was a deep, velvet canopy of black, pierced by the sharp light of 1,000 distant stars. Frost had begun to crystallize on the window panes of the small brick cottages, and the smell of damp earth and chimney smoke hung low in the stillness. It was a time for peace, for family, and for the soft traditions of a winter's dawn. Yet, before the first light of the sun could touch the horizon, the silence of Warminster was not merely broken. It was shattered by something that defied every law of nature known to the people living there. The first ripples of the mystery began long before most residents had even opened their eyes. At approximately 1:25 in the morning, while the town lay dreaming, a woman named Mildred Head was jolted into wakefulness. She lay in the darkness of her bedroom, her breath blooming in the chilly air, listening to a sound that made no sense. It began as a light, rhythmic scratching, as if the bare branches of a winter tree were being dragged across the roof tiles by a mischievous wind. But there was no wind that night. The air outside was preternaturally still. As she watched the ceiling, the sound intensified, transforming from a gentle scrape into a violent lashing. It was as if giant hailstones were being hurled against her home with impossible force. Yet there was no rhythm to the impact, only a chaotic, aggressive drumming that seemed to vibrate through the very rafters of the house. Her husband, who was deaf, slept soundly beside her, unaware that their sanctuary was being besieged by an invisible deluge. Mildred eventually gathered the courage to rise, her bare feet pressing against the cold floorboards as she moved to the window. She pulled back the heavy curtains, expecting to see a storm-tossed landscape or perhaps a flock of birds caught in some strange frenzy. Instead, she saw only the frozen garden and the silent, starlit street. There was no rain. There were no stones. There was only a low, predatory hum that began to vibrate in the back of her throat, a sound that slowly faded into a thin, wheezing whistle before vanishing into the night. It was an omen of the morning to come. As the clocks ticked toward 6 in the morning, another resident, Marjorie By, was beginning her own Christmas rituals. Marjorie was a woman of habit and faith, a grandmother in her 60s who found comfort in the early morning quiet. She dressed carefully in the dark, pulling on a heavy wool coat and wrapping a thick scarf around her neck to ward off the Wiltshire chill. The house was silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. She stepped out into the crisp air of Christmas morning, her shoes crunching softly on the thin layer of frost that coated the pavement. Her destination was Christ Church for the Holy Communion service, a walk she had taken many times before. The town was a ghost of itself at this hour. The street lamps cast long, orange shadows across the empty roads, and the air was so sharp it bit at her nose and cheeks. As she made her way toward the area known as Bell Hill, the silence began to feel heavy, almost tactile. The usual morning sounds, the distant lowing of cattle or the occasional rustle of a nocturnal animal, were entirely absent. It was as if the town were holding its breath, waiting for a blow to fall. Marjorie reached the vicinity of Ludlow Close, her mind likely focused on the warmth of the church and the familiar carols of the season, when the first sign of the thing manifested. It was a crackling sound, low and rhythmic, like a heavy lorry driving over a bed of dry gravel. She paused, looking around for the source, but the road was empty. The sound grew louder, moving from the ground to the air above her, swirling with a metallic, grinding undertone that made the hair on her arms stand on end. The transition from sound to physical assault was instantaneous. As Marjorie approached the church, the air around her seemed to solidify. The crackling noise exploded into what she would later describe as a sonic deluge, a wall of vibrations so intense they felt like physical blows. It was not a noise one hears with the ears, but a force one feels in the marrow of their bones. The intensity was chilling, a savage pounding that descended upon her from the empty sky. She felt as though invisible fingers of sound were reaching down, pinning her to the cold earth. The shock waves struck her head, her neck, and her shoulders with a violent, rhythmic pressure. It was as if the atmosphere itself had turned into a heavy, liquid weight, pressing her downward, draining the strength from her limbs until she felt feeble and small. There was no light, no craft, and no visible intruder, only the overwhelming, terrifying presence of the vibrations. Marjorie stood paralyzed, her heart racing against the invisible tide. The sky above remained clear and starlit, showing no sign of the mechanical beast that seemed to be hovering just feet above her head. The sound was a whining, crackling, rasping, droning cacophony that tore the quiet morning into raucous rags. For several minutes, she was a prisoner of this sonic cage, unable to move, unable to scream, existing only in a state of pure vibrational agony. She felt as though she were being disintegrated by a force she could not name, a thing that existed only as a ghost of noise and pressure. Eventually, the pressure began to lift, as suddenly as it had arrived. The savage vibrations tapered off, receding back into that strange, metallic hum before fading into a faint, wheezing whistle that vanished toward the hills. Marjorie was left trembling on the path, her body aching from the phantom weight that had just released her. She managed to reach the sanctuary of the church, her face pale and her hands shaking as she moved through the heavy oak doors. She was not alone in her distress. Across the town, others were waking to the aftermath of a morning that defied logic. At a nearby army camp on the Salisbury Plain, soldiers had been jolted from their bunks by a sound they described as a massive chimney stack being ripped from a roof and scattered in pieces across the compound. Roger Rump, the local postmaster, had listened in horror as his own roof tiles seemed to be plucked up by an invisible hand and slammed back into place with a terrifying clatter. When the sun finally rose over Warminster on that Christmas day, it revealed a town in a state of quiet, bewildered shock. There was no physical damage to be found, no broken tiles, no fallen chimneys, no footprints in the frost. Yet the memory of the vibrations lingered like a bruise. The authorities were contacted, but the police and the military could offer no explanation. There were whispers of secret experiments, of atmospheric electricity, or perhaps a festive prank gone wrong. But for Marjorie Bye and the 30 other residents who had felt the thing, that morning, the truth was far more unsettling. The vibrations of Christmas Day were merely the beginning, a calling card from an intruder that would haunt the skies of Warminster for years to come. As January of 1965 settled over the rolling hills of Wiltshire, a heavy, expectant silence gripped the town of Warminster. The initial shocks of the previous December had not faded. Instead, they had curdled into a persistent, low-level dread that seemed to cling to the very stonework of the buildings. The winter air was exceptionally sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant, coal-fired warmth of hearths. Yet even in the sanctuary of their homes, the residents felt a strange instability in the atmosphere. It was as if the town had been placed inside a bell jar, and something invisible was tapping against the glass. People moved through the streets with a new kind of haste, their eyes occasionally darting upward toward the gray, clouded ceiling of the sky. They were looking for something they could not name, a presence that had announced itself through sound, but remained frustratingly hidden from sight. The local journalist, Arthur Shuttlewood, began to find his days consumed by the mounting pile of letters arriving at his desk, each one a whispered confession of an encounter with the unknown. These were not the tall tales of thrill-seekers, but the sober, frightened accounts of farmers, housewives, and postmasters, all describing a world that had suddenly, inexplicably, lost its footing. By the time February arrived, the phenomenon began to shift, growing more aggressive and harder to ignore. It was no longer just a series of isolated bumps in the night. The sound, which the locals had taken to calling the thing, developed a texture that was hauntingly physical. Witnesses described it as a high-pitched, electrical drone that felt like a needle pressing against the eardrums. In the early morning hours, when the frost was still thick on the window panes, families would be jolted awake by a sensation of immense pressure. It was not merely a noise. It was a vibration that traveled through the floorboards and into the bones of the sleepers. Some said it sounded like thousands of roof tiles being ripped away by a violent wind, only to be slammed back into place seconds later with a deafening clatter. Others compared it to the sound of giant hailstones battering the shingles. Yet when they looked outside, the night was perfectly still, the trees motionless, and the sky devoid of any storm. This invisible menace seemed to target the very structures people called home, shaking the foundations and rattling the glass in its frames, leaving behind a lingering hum that tasted like copper on the tongue and made the hair on the back of one's neck stand in a primal, instinctive warning. The most chilling manifestation of this unseen force occurred near a quiet stretch of road known as 5 Ash Lane. High above the skeletal, frost-dusted oaks, a flock of pigeons was navigating the pale winter light. They moved in that familiar, fluid motion of birds in flight, a sudden tilt of wings against the horizon. But then, the air itself seemed to tear. A jagged, static crackle erupted in the sky, a sound described by those nearby as being like a massive sheet of silk being shredded by invisible teeth. In an heartbeat, the graceful rhythm of the flock was shattered. The birds did not tumble or struggle, they simply ceased to fly. They plummeted toward the frozen earth like leaden weights, their small bodies striking the ground with soft, rhythmic thuds. When the silence returned, the woods were left in a state of unnatural stillness. There were no marks on the birds, no signs of predators or disease. They had simply been extinguished in midair by a sonic assault that left the human observers trembling with a profound sense of vulnerability. It was a clear, terrifying signal that whatever was haunting, Warminster had the power to reach out and touch the living, leaving a trail of quiet casualties in its wake. As the weeks pressed on into March of 1965, the psychological toll on the community became visible in the smallest details of daily life. Animals, more sensitive to the shifting frequencies of the earth, were the first to show the strain. In the quiet corners of the town, dogs would begin to howl at empty spaces in the sky, their hackles raised as they backed away from invisible barriers. On one particular afternoon, the Brown family watched in horror as their domestic cat was overcome by a sudden, violent illness, its body reacting as if it were being buffeted by internal waves of energy. Livestock in the surrounding fields were found huddling together in the corners of their pens, refusing to graze, their eyes wide with a frantic, uncomprehending fear. The people of Warminster began to feel a similar exhaustion. Conversations at the local market were no longer about the weather or the harvest, but about the quality of the silence in their own bedrooms. They spoke of the metallic grinding sounds that seemed to hover over their chimneys and the way the air felt thick and heavy, like the moments just before a massive lightning strike. There was a growing consensus that the town was being observed, or perhaps used as a testing ground for something far beyond their understanding. An invisible predator that moved through the frequencies of the world. The dread was not just in the sounds. but in the physical sensations that accompanied them. Many residents reported a feeling of being pinned down, as if a great, invisible hand were pressing them into their mattresses or the soil of their gardens. This sensation of atmospheric weight was often preceded by a low, rhythmic thumping, a sound that one witness likened to the heartbeat of a giant. It was a vibration so deep that it could be felt in the chest cavity, a resonant frequency that seemed to bypass the ears entirely. This was the invisible menace in its most intimate form, an intrusion into the very sanctuary of the body. Even the skeptics, those who tried to blame the nearby military exercises on Salisbury Plain, found their explanations ringing hollow as the incidents multiplied in areas far from any training grounds. The phenomenon was too precise, too personal, and far too strange to be mere artillery fire. It was as if the fabric of reality in this small corner of Wiltshire had become thin and frayed, allowing something from the periphery to bleed through. As the spring of 1965 approached, the people of Warminster realized that the static and the screams of the roof tiles were merely the overture. The true nature of the thing was about to reveal itself in a way that would change the town forever. Arthur Shuttlewood sat in the dim, amber light of the Warminster Journal office. The rhythmic, heavy ticking of a grandfather clock in the far corner, marking the passage of an unusually quiet evening. The air in the small room was cool and carried the deep, comforting scent of old newsprint and the metallic tang of dried ink. For many years, his world had been defined by the gentle, predictable mundane, small-town council meetings, minor infractions in the local court, and the ebb and flow of village life in the heart of Wiltshire. But as the winter of 1964 bled into the early months of 1965, a different kind of story began to weigh upon his desk. It arrived first in hushed whispers over garden fences, then in handwritten letters that smelled of fireplace smoke and damp wool. One such letter, penned by a woman named Marjorie Bye, described an experience so visceral it seemed to vibrate against his fingertips. She spoke of a walk toward Christ Church on Christmas morning, where the very air around her seemed to shatter. She had been pinned down, she said, by invisible fingers of sound that pounded at her head and shoulders. A sonic weight so heavy it felt as though the atmosphere had turned to solid lead. Arthur, a veteran of the Grenadier Guards with a sharp, disciplined mind, found himself smiling at first. He had seen much of the world, and he prided himself on a bedrock of integrity that left little room for the fantastic. He imagined it was perhaps the wind or the overactive imagination of a tired soul. Yet as he leaned back in his creaking wooden chair, the silence of the office felt suddenly thinner, as if something were waiting just beyond the glass of the window pane. The skepticism did not last. Within a few short weeks, the letters transformed from a trickle into a deluge that threatened to overwhelm his filing system. Arthur began to keep a separate file, a thick manila folder that grew heavier with every passing sunset. More than 30 residents eventually came forward, each echoing the same haunting details of that Christmas morning and the unsettling days that followed. They spoke of what Arthur would come to call the Bell Hill Mystery, a name he gave to the first series of reports in an article tucked away in the middle pages of the journal. He wrote of the strange, unearthly vibrations and the menacing sounds that seemed to hunt the Wiltshire skies. He listened to the accounts of Mildred Head, who had been jarred from her sleep at 1:25 in the morning by a noise that sounded like giant hailstones lashing at her roof, though the night outside was dry, still, and perfectly clear. He spoke with the local postmaster, Roger Rump, a man of standing and logic who had felt the same jarring tremors. As Arthur moved through the town, his leather-soled shoes clicking softly on the cobblestones, he began to notice a change in the air of Warminster itself. It was no longer just a quiet garrison town. It was a place where people walked with their chins tilted slightly upward, eyes searching the heavy gray clouds for a glimpse of the impossible. The vibrant blue ink of his fountain pen, began to fill the first of many notebooks, capturing the fear that hummed beneath the surface of the community, a low-frequency dread that no local ordinance could quiet. By the time the heavy heat of August 1965 settled over the rolling hills of the Salisbury Plain, Arthur had filled 8 complete notebooks. Their covers were worn at the edges from being shoved into his coat pocket, and the pages were dense with a frantic, looping script. He had become the unofficial chronicler of the inexplicable, a man who stood on the threshold between the known world and the terrifying unknown. He spent his nights in the shadow of Clay Hill, the grass cool and damp against his boots, the smell of wild clover and dark earth rising around him in the moonlight. He was no longer alone in his observations. The town was beginning to boil over with curiosity and fright. On the 27th of August, more than 300 people packed into the town hall, an old stone building that seemed to groan under the weight of so much collective anxiety. Hundreds more spilled out into the street, their voices a low, worried murmur that competed with the distant, mechanical rumble of military trucks from the nearby barracks. Inside, the air was stifling and thick, smelling of damp raincoats, and the ozone-heavy heat of the television camera crew's arc lights. Arthur sat in the press gallery, watching as the chairman of the Urban District Council tried to maintain a sense of order. People stood to tell their stories, of birds falling dead from the sky, of pets reacting with violent terror as invisible sounds tore through their homes, and of brilliant stars that danced with a purpose no astronomer could explain. It was here, amidst the chaos of the meeting and the flashing of camera bulbs, that the mystery truly shed its local skin and became something larger, something Arthur would soon name with a simplicity that only added to its inherent terror. His own conversion, the moment the journalist became a true believer, arrived on the afternoon of September 28, 1965. The sun was beginning its slow, golden descent, casting long, amber shadows across the familiar landscape of his home. Arthur was looking out of his window, his mind likely drifting through the hundreds of testimonies he had painstakingly recorded, when he saw it. A cigar-shaped craft, which he would later describe with a poetic, startled flair as a banana boat in the sky, was gliding with an impossible, silent grace through the upper atmosphere. It was a giant, silvered and sleek, a stark and alien intrusion against the familiar soft blue of the Wiltshire sky. As he watched, a profound sense of power seemed to radiate from the object, a physical pressure that he felt in the very marrow of his bones. Then a beam of light, precise and terrifyingly bright, was pushed out from the craft. It struck him with the force of a physical blow, though it was entirely weightless. He felt a sudden, cold paralysis grip his limbs, a sensation of being held in place by a force that did not belong to this earth. In that moment of frozen time, the skepticism he had worn like a suit of armor for 44 years shattered into 1,000 pieces. He realized then that the witnesses had not been victims of mass hysteria or the simple trickery of light. They were the heralds of a new age. The thing, as he began to call it, was not just a sound or a light. It was a presence, an intelligence that had chosen this specific patch of England to reveal its incomprehensible power. The name he gave it, the Warminster thing, stuck to the mystery like a permanent shadow. It was a perfect, evocative label that captured the sheer ambiguity of the phenomenon. It was not a saucer, or a plane, or a ghost. It was simply a thing, a noun that served as a vessel for everything the people could not explain. Arthur's writing grew more urgent and detailed, his articles in the Warminster Journal, now the primary source for a nation, suddenly obsessed with the fate of the small town. He described the unearthly blue light that had been seen over Lulsgate Bottom and the shrill whine that accompanied the sightings, a sound like 1,000 cicadas screaming in unison. He moved through the streets of Warminster no longer just as a reporter, but as a guide, leading groups of sky scouts to the peaks of Cradle Hill to watch the heavens. His life had been irrevocably altered. The man who once documented mundane council minutes now found himself receiving strange, midnight phone calls from voices that claimed to represent distant worlds beyond the stars. As he sat at his typewriter, the keys clacking softly in the late-night silence, he knew that the peaceful, predictable Warminster he had moved to in 1940 was gone forever. It had been replaced by a place of wonder and dread, a town where the line between the ground beneath one's feet and the vast, cold reaches of space had become thin enough to break. The journalist's notebook was no longer a mere record of local facts. It was a map of a new reality, one where the presence of the thing was only the beginning of a much longer journey into the dark. By the arrival of August 1965, the heavy, humid air of the Wiltshire summer seemed to hold its breath. The mystery had fundamentally shifted. For months, the people of Warminster had lived in a state of sonic siege, enduring the invisible weight of the thing as it tore through roof tiles and vibrated the very marrow of their bones. But as the leaves began their slow, gilded turn toward autumn, the auditory terror receded, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. In its place came something even more spectacular, and perhaps more unsettling. The invisible walker had found its form. The sounds that had once sounded like 1,000 humming refrigerators or the violent shattering of a giant chimney stack were now accompanied by a silent, luminous theater in the sky. It was as if the phenomenon had decided to show itself, trading its voice for a blinding, amber glare that would soon draw the eyes of the entire world to the dark slopes of the surrounding hills. Arthur Shuttlewood, the tireless journalist whose notebooks were already swelling with hundreds of accounts, felt the change in the atmosphere. The fear that had gripped the town in the early months of the year was being replaced by a restless, electric curiosity. No longer were people merely cowering under their blankets as their houses shook. They were stepping out into the night, heads tilted back, searching the velvet blackness for a glimpse of the Cosa. The focus of this new visual era centered on a few specific landmarks that rose like ancient sentinels above the town. Cradle Hill and Star Hill became the altars of this new movement. Over the August Bank holiday of 1965, the quiet rural landscape was transformed into a bustling encampment. An estimated 8,000 people descended upon Warminster, a town that usually hummed with the quiet rhythm of a market community. They came from across the country, their cars lining the narrow verges of the roads until the metal reflections stretched for miles under the summer sun. As dusk fell, the pilgrimage moved upward. Thousands of boots crunched against the dry, yellowed grass of Cradle Hill. The scent of crushed wild thyme and damp chalk rose from the earth as families and loan seekers alike staked out their positions. They brought with them the comforts of a long vigil. Heavy wool blankets to ward off the creeping Wiltshire damp, thermos flasks that hissed as they were opened, releasing the comforting steam of sweet tea, and binocular cases that clicked open in the deepening twilight. There was a strange, communal patience to the crowd. They sat in the tall grass, their faces illuminated by the occasional orange ember of a cigarette or the faint, greenish glow of a watch dial, all waiting for the sky to break its silence. When the lights did appear, they did not arrive with a roar, but with a terrifying, absolute stillness. Witnesses began to report objects that defied every known law of mid-century aviation. Some described cigar-shaped craft, long and silvered like a needle, winking with a rhythmic series of bright lights along their flanks. These were not the fleeting streaks of meteors or the steady drone of a passing passenger plane. They were stationary, hanging in the sky over the Boreham Field estate or hovering with impossible grace above the peaks of the hills. One woman, Rachel Atwill, recounted being woken at nearly 4 o'clock in the morning by a droning sound that made her bed shudder, only to see a bright object like a massive star suspended just 200 yards above the ridgeline. Others spoke of seeing what looked like twin red-hot pokers, glowing with a fierce intensity, hanging vertically in the sky with a void of absolute blackness between them. There were amber orbs that moved with a liquid agility, darting across the horizon before making sudden, 90-degree turns that would have crushed a human pilot. The sky had become a canvas for the impossible. Shuttlewood himself would later describe a craft that looked like a great banana boat, a golden crescent of fire that drifted over the landscape, casting a sickly, beautiful light upon the upturned faces of the watchers below. But the watchers on Cradle Hill were not the only ones keeping a vigil. Warminster sat on the very edge of the Salisbury Plain military training area, a vast, restricted expanse where the British Army had long conducted its most secretive maneuvers. As the public gatherings grew in size, so too did the visible presence of the military. From the vantage point of the hills, the skywatchers could see the silhouettes of trucks and heavy equipment moving along the distant, restricted tracks. The sound of boots on gravel and the muffled commands of officers occasionally drifted on the wind, mingling with the whispers of the UFO seekers. Most striking were the Army searchlights. On several nights in August 1965, as the crowd watched a mysterious amber light traverse the sky, a powerful military beam would suddenly cut through the darkness, reaching out like a long, white finger to probe the object. In an instant, the phenomenon would black out, vanishing into the night as if it had never been there. Moments later, the searchlights would often pivot, sweeping across the slopes of Star Hill and bathing the startled civilians in a blinding, accusatory glare. This cat-and-mouse game between the sky and the state created a thick layer of tension. Was the Cosa a visitor from another world, or was it a secret of the plane, a prototype being tested under the cover of the very hysteria it created? The military remained officially silent, their denials as cold and impenetrable as the stone circles of nearby Stonehenge. The sensory experience of those nights was one of profound contradiction. On one hand, there was the festive, almost carnival-like atmosphere of the crowds, the rustle of sandwich wrappers, and the quiet chatter of teenagers who were more interested in each other than the stars. On the other hand, there was a deep, primeval sense of being watched. Those who ventured further from the main groups, toward the shadowed copses or the lonely stretches of 5 Ash Lane, reported a heavy, negative sensation that pressed against their chests. It was the feeling of a presence that was both metallic and alive. Sometimes, a high-pitched whine would pierce the night, a remnant of the thing's earlier voice, causing the hair on the back of the neck to stand up. The air would grow cold, not with the natural chill of a summer night, but with a sudden, localized drop in temperature that left frost on the windows of parked cars. By the end of 1965, Warminster was no longer just a town. It was a theater of the unknown. Thousands had seen the lights, hundreds had felt the vibrations, and everyone was looking for an answer that seemed to drift just out of reach, hovering like a cigar-shaped shadow against the vast, indifferent Wiltshire sky. The mystery of the Cosa had matured, growing from a series of strange noises into a visual spectacle that demanded the world's attention, while the hills themselves kept their ancient, silent watch over the town below. By the arrival of 1966, the atmosphere in Warminster had shifted from the sharp, jolting shock of a new mystery into something more heavy and pervasive. The early novelty of the strange sounds had settled into the bones of the town, like a damp winter fog that refuses to lift. While the crowds on the hills still gathered, there was a growing weariness in the eyes of the locals who walked the steep paths to Cradle Hill and Star Hill. The nights were no longer just a spectacle. They had become a vigil. Imagine standing on the crest of a chalk down as the sun dips below the horizon, the sky turning the color of a bruised plum. The air here is thin and carries the scent of cold earth and ancient stone. In those years, the silence of the Wiltshire countryside felt different. It was no longer a peaceful absence of noise, but a thick, expectant pressure, as if the landscape itself were holding its breath, waiting for the sky to crack open once more. It was during this period that the phenomenon began to leave a physical signature upon the earth. Witnesses began to discover what they called nests. These were not the haphazard tangles of birds or the burrows of foxes, but perfect, deliberate geometries pressed into the high grass and the swaying reeds of the marshes. Imagine walking into a field of tall, golden wheat in the dim light of dawn and finding a circle, exactly 30 feet in diameter, where the stalks had been laid flat. They weren't broken or snapped. They were swept smoothly into a clockwise swirl, as if a giant, invisible hand had gently ironed them into a spiral. When you reached out to touch the grass, it felt oddly inert, the natural spring of the plant gone, replaced by a strange, flattened stillness. These circles were often found in the most isolated reaches of the downs, far from any road where a vehicle might have ventured. To the people of 1967, these nests were the terrifying proof that whatever haunted their skies was capable of reaching down and touching the very soil they walked upon. The psychological toll of these years began to manifest in the quietest corners of the community. Sleep became a luxury for many. In the small terraced houses that lined the lanes near the hills, residents spoke of a peculiar vibration that would hum through the floorboards in the deep hours of the night. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears, but a low-frequency thrumming that settled in the chest, making the heart skip and the skin prickle with an inexplicable dread. Families would sit together in the dark, watching the shadows dance across their bedroom walls, wondering if the orange lights they called the amber gamblers would appear outside their windows. These lights were described as bobbing orbs of fire, moving with a fluid, intelligent grace through the trees. They didn't fly like planes. They danced, stopping midair with a suddenness that defied the laws of physics, before darting away into the blackness of the woods. The constant vigilance, the endless skywatching, left the town in a state of collective exhaustion. They were a people living on the edge of a world they no longer understood. There were moments when the encounter became painfully physical. Some who found themselves alone in the dark lanes between Sutton Common and Heytesbury reported a sensation of being pinned by sound. One woman, walking to a morning service as the clock struck 6, described the air suddenly thickening around her. It was as if the atmosphere had turned to liquid, becoming heavy and resistant to her movement. A sound like the dragging of heavy, splintered branches across a gravel road erupted from the empty air above her head. She felt a profound weakness in her limbs, a draining of her very essence that forced her to lean against a cold stone wall for support. It was a visceral, terrifying experience of powerlessness. In those moments, the mystery of Warminster wasn't a story in a newspaper or a light in the sky. It was a physical weight, a crushing presence that seemed to drain the life from the very ground beneath her feet. The darkness of the lanes felt hungry, as if it were seeking to draw the spirit out of anyone brave enough to walk them alone. By the end of 1967, the hills around the town had become a stage for the unexplained. On Cradle Hill, groups of 30 or 40 people would sit in silence, wrapped in heavy wool coats against the biting Wiltshire wind, their faces upturned to the stars. They would watch satellites drift across the black expanse, only to see them suddenly pause, spiral in perfect, compass-drawn circles, and then continue their journey as if nothing had happened. There was a strange pride in the town, a feeling that they had been chosen by some vast, cosmic force to be the witnesses of a new age. But beneath that pride was a deep, unsettling mystery that no one could solve. The physical evidence, the nests, the burnt film in cameras, the singed patches of earth, remained as silent witnesses to events that defied logic. As the decade began to turn, the shadows on the downs grew longer, and the silence of the countryside became a vast, echoing chamber, filled with the ghosts of questions that would never be answered. The people of Warminster went to their beds each night knowing that just beyond their curtains, in the dark, swaying grass of the hills, something was still watching. As the calendar of the 1960s turned its final, heavy pages, a strange and weighted stillness began to settle over the ancient chalk hills of Wiltshire. The frantic, Electric energy that had once gripped the town of Warminster started to thin, much like the morning mist caught in the first tentative warmth of a rising sun. On Cradle Hill, where so many hundreds had once huddled together under thick wool blankets, clutching flasks of lukewarm tea and scanning the heavens, the crowds were growing smaller. The vibrant, crackling electricity that many claimed to feel in the very marrow of their bones, a sensation like 1,000 tiny needles dancing upon the skin, began to ebb away. The grass on the ridges, once flattened and bruised by the restless feet of seekers, began to stand tall and proud once more, swaying in the gentle, cool breeze that swept across the vast Salisbury Plain. The sky, which had once been a vast canvas for dancing lights and sonic disturbances that rattled the leaded windows of the town's oldest cottages, returned to its ancient, velvety blackness. One could stand on the ridge now and hear nothing but the distant, rhythmic lowing of cattle in the valley, or the soft, velvet rustle of an owl's wings cutting through the dark. The thing was receding into the realm of memory, leaving behind a community changed forever by the touch of the impossible. Arthur Shuttlewood, the tireless journalist for the Warminster Journal, continued to sit in his small office, the air thick with the scent of old ink, yellowing newsprint, and the faint, lingering trail of pipe tobacco. His fingers, perhaps a bit slower now, still danced across the keys of his typewriter, recording the final trickles of reports that came in from the surrounding villages. He had become the reluctant shepherd of the strange, the man to whom every shadow and sound was eventually brought for inspection. His notebooks were filled with the testimonies of thousands, police officers, farmers, and skeptics who had all seen their world view shattered by a cigar-shaped craft or a humming vibration that stopped their car engines dead. But as the 1970s approached, the reports became less frequent, less violent. The sonic attacks that had once knocked people to the ground or killed flocks of pigeons in midair were replaced by distant, pulsing lights that seemed to tease from the very edge of the horizon. The town began to reconcile its new identity. The local pubs still hummed with the echoes of these stories, the air warm and heavy with the clinking of glass and the low murmur of voices, but the urgency had faded into a quiet, enduring wonder. People would look up at the stars and no longer see just cold, distant points of light, but a door left slightly ajar. To truly understand what remained when the lights dimmed, one must look toward the sprawling, shadowed expanse of the Salisbury Plain. For decades, this land had been the silent playground of the military, a place where the earth itself seemed to hold its breath under the weight of secrets. Some whispered in the corner of the town square that the sightings were nothing more than the secret whispers of technology, experimental aircraft from the nearby Boscombe Down, or the testing of strange, silent propulsion systems that the public was never meant to witness. They spoke of the way the air would suddenly vibrate, a low-frequency hum that felt like a second heartbeat inside the chest, perhaps a side effect of radar experiments or sonic weaponry being refined in the deep, hidden bunkers of Porton Down. Others suggested that the thing was a collective hallucination, a psychological response to the tensions of the Cold War, carried on the damp evening wind. Yet, these explanations felt thin and hollow to those who had stood on the cold chalk soil and felt the air grow heavy with a presence that felt almost sentient. A military craft, no matter how advanced, did not usually behave with the playful, curious grace that the Warminster phenomenon displayed. The logic of science struggled to contain the sheer, unbridled strangeness of those years, leaving a gap that only the imagination could fill. There were those who looked even deeper into the soil of Wiltshire for answers. They spoke of the ley lines, invisible veins of energy that were said to crisscross the English countryside, meeting in a powerful confluence right beneath the feet of Warminster. They pointed to the proximity of Stonehenge and Avebury, those great, silent stone sentinels standing just a few miles away, and wondered if the town was a gateway, a place where the veil between our world and another had grown thin and frayed. In the late 1960s, this idea took deep root, blending with the burgeoning counterculture that sought meaning beyond the material and the mundane. The mist on the hills was no longer just water vapor. It was a shroud for the divine, a soft blanket covering a portal to the stars. When the wind howled through the twisted trees at Star Hill, it was interpreted as a voice from a place we couldn't yet reach. The legacy of these years was not found in a piece of wreckage or a clear, undeniable photograph, but in the way the townspeople learned to live alongside the unknown. They accepted that some things were meant to be felt rather than understood, and that the shadows of the valley held secrets that would never fully belong to the harsh light of day. As the final years of the decade slipped away into the early 1970s, the thing became a legend whispered to children as they were tucked into their warm beds, the stories of the mid-60s becoming the folklore of the next generation. The sonic booms that had once terrified the livestock and cracked the plaster of old stone cottages were replaced by the familiar, comforting sounds of the English night. The distant, rhythmic hum of a car on a lonely road, the soft, steady patter of rain against a window pane, and the sigh of the wind in the eaves. The hills of clay and cradle remained, ancient and indifferent, watching over the town with a silent, stony gaze as they had for thousands of years. The mystery didn't end with a definitive answer or a grand revelation. It simply dissolved into the fabric of the landscape, becoming as much a part of Warminster as the church spires and the market square. To walk the paths of the hills today is to step into a ghost of that era. The air still feels heavy with the weight of thousands of eyes that once scanned the horizon with equal parts hope and fear. The mystery remains a part of the soil, a part of the white mist that rolls off the plain, a reminder that we are never truly alone in the dark. The lights have dimmed now, and the sky over Warminster has returned to its quiet, starlit peace. The echoes of the 1960s have faded into the soft rustle of the leaves and the steady, calming rhythm of your own breath. The questions that once burned so brightly in the hearts of the seekers are now just embers, cooling slowly in the hearth of history. There is no more need to search the horizon or strain your ears for the sound of the unknown. The world is still, the hills are asleep, and the secrets of the thing are tucked away in the deep, velvet folds of time. You can let go of the wonder and the worry now. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.